Welcome. Settle in gently. Let the day loosen its grip and allow your breathing to grow slower and softer. Tonight, we travel to a small medieval village hidden at the edge of a dark forest, a place so quiet and so ordinary that most travelers would have passed it without a second glance. It was the kind of village where roofs sagged under old straw, where smoke rose lazily from crooked chimneys, and where the same narrow paths had been walked for generations by the same tired boots. At the center of this village stood a modest stone church with a narrow bell tower, plain and weathered and familiar to every soul for miles around. Nothing about it was grand. Nothing about it was beautiful in the way castles or cathedrals were meant to be beautiful, but it was steady, reliable. It had been there longer than most people could remember, and above its roof hung the bell that ordered the lives of everyone below. That bell marked the hours. It called the villagers to prayer. It warned them of fire, of storm, of trouble on the road. And in a world where nearly everything felt uncertain, that bell felt constant. It rang at dawn, it rang at noon, and it rang again in the evening, just as the last pale light slipped beyond the trees and the village folded itself towards sleep. It always rang, until one night it did not. The evening had begun as countless others had begun before it. A thin soup simmered in iron pots. A few coarse loaves sat cooling on wooden boards. Candles were lit one by one behind tiny windows. The chickens had already tucked themselves into their dark corners. A dog barked once in the distance and then, deciding nothing more was worth the effort, fell silent. The people of the village moved through their familiar routines without hurry. A woman wrung out a cloth beside a bucket of gray water. An old man shut the door of his shed with both hands and a tired sigh. A child was pulled gently indoors by the sleeve before the cold could settle too deeply in his bones. And as the sky dimmed to blue and then to charcoal, Brother Alden made his usual walk toward the church. Alden was an old monk, though not the kind remembered in stories. He was not especially wise, not especially stern, and certainly not impressive to look at. His shoulders bent slightly with age. His beard had grown thin and uneven. His hands, rough and dry, looked more like a farmer's hands than a holy man's. But he was dependable, and in a place like that, dependable was nearly as good as noble. Every evening before the final bell, he checked the tower. Always the same ritual. He crossed the churchyard slowly, lantern in hand. He unlocked the narrow wooden door at the base of the tower. He climbed the winding stone steps one by one. He listened to the old structure creak softly around him, and then he waited for the familiar sound that had marked the end of day for longer than he had been alive. It was a small duty, but one he took seriously. That night, however, as soon as he stepped inside the tower, something felt wrong. Not loudly wrong, not dramatically wrong. Nothing leapt from the shadows. No sudden wind blew out his lantern. No ghostly voice called his name from the darkness. It was something quieter than that. The air felt too still. The tower always had a certain movement to it, a draft through the cracks, a murmur of old stone cooling after the day, the faintest sway in the rope when the wind passed over the roof. But now there was only stillness, thick and pressed down, as if the tower were holding its breath. Alden paused with one foot on the first stair. He waited. Nothing. He told himself he was tired. The day had been long, and cold weather had a way of creeping into old joints and making everything feel heavier than it was. So he lifted the lantern a little higher and began to climb. The steps were narrow and uneven, hollowed by centuries of use. He knew them well enough to walk them in darkness. Still that evening, each footfall seemed louder than usual, as though the tower were returning the sound too sharply. Halfway up he stopped again. He had heard something, a faint scrape, very soft, like rough rope dragged slowly across dry wood. Alden turned his head and listened. The sound did not come again. For several moments he remained there in silence, one hand resting against the cold stone wall, the lantern trembling only slightly in his grip. He could hear his own breathing. He could hear somewhere below the tiny crackle of the lantern flame, and then nothing. No rope, no wind, no bell. He continued upward. By the time he reached the top chamber, his mouth had gone dry. The bell hung before him, broad and dark in the lantern light, just where it had always hung. The rope dangled beneath it. The wooden beams above were unchanged. The small slits in the stone walls still showed strips of darkening sky. Everything looked the same, and yet everything felt different. The bell was not moving. That in itself was strange. Even in calm weather it usually shifted slightly, enough to produce the faintest creak or sway, but now it hung perfectly still, like something painted into the air rather than suspended in it. Alden stepped closer. The lantern's golden light slid slowly across the bronze. At first he noticed only the usual marks, worn patches, slight discolorations, the dull sheen of age and handling. Then, as he leaned in, he saw something that made him stop at once. A crack, thin, crooked, unmistakable. It ran down one side of the bell like a dark scar. He stared at it without moving. That crack had not been there before. He was certain of it. Alden came to this place every evening. He knew the bell as a shepherd knows the shape of his own gate, as a cook knows the handle of her own knife. He would have noticed such a thing. He must have. Yet there it was. He raised the lantern higher, bringing the bell fully into light. The crack seemed almost delicate, but there was something unsettling about it. It looked less like damage and more like a line drawn with intention, as though the metal had opened itself from within. Alden swallowed. Then very slowly he reached out. His hand hovered for a moment before touching the bronze. The bell was cold, far too cold, not cool from evening air, not chilled by stone, but cold in a deeper way, as if no warmth had touched it in years. He flinched, but only slightly, and then he heard it. A sound from inside the bell. Not a ring, not a hum, not a vibration. A whisper, so faint it might have been imagined, so soft it might have been only the shifting of his own blood in his ears. But Alden heard it. He jerked his hand back. The whisper came again, or something like it. Low and thin and impossible to follow, as though a voice were speaking from a great distance through layers of metal and air. His heart began to pound. The lantern shook more noticeably now, scattering the light in restless flickers across the beams and the cracked bronze. He took one step back, then another. He did not know why he felt afraid. He only knew that he did. The bell had always belonged to the village. It was a tool, a signal, a comfort, but standing there in the cramped darkness of the tower, Alden felt that the thing before him was no longer familiar at all. It felt like an intruder wearing the shape of something holy. He waited for the evening ringing to begin by itself. It did not. He looked at the rope. He looked at the crack. He listened to the dead stillness pressing in from every side, and for the first time in anyone's memory, the hour passed in silence. No bell echoed through the lanes, no final note floated over the rooftops, no old women crossed themselves at the familiar sound, no dogs lifted their heads, no children paused to listen. The village simply slipped into night without realizing that something ancient and dependable had failed. Outside, candles burned lower, doors were bolted, beds creaked. The forest stood black and close around the edge of the fields, and above it all, in the tower, Brother Alden remained frozen in the lantern glow, staring at the cracked bell that had not rung. He felt, though he could not have explained why, that the village had crossed some invisible threshold, that something had ended, and something else, quieter and far more troubling, had just begun. The morning came, but not in the way it always had. There was no bell to greet it, no deep familiar sound rolling across the village, no signal to rise, to begin, to move, only silence. At first no one noticed. People woke slowly as they always did. A man turned in his bed, expecting the sound that would pull him from sleep, but it never came. A woman opened her eyes to the dim light creeping through her window, feeling that something was missing. Though she could not yet name it, the village stirred, but without rhythm, later than usual, slower, uneven. A farmer stepped outside, confused by the light. "Strange," he muttered. He looked toward the church tower. The bell hung there, small and distant, unmoving. By mid-morning the absence had become impossible to ignore. People began to speak of it in quiet voices. "The bell didn't ring. Did you hear it?" "No, not at all." The words spread slowly like smoke. Not panic, not yet, just unease. At the church, Brother Alden had not slept. He sat at the base of the tower, his lantern long extinguished, his hands resting heavily in his lap. He had tried once, just once, to pull the rope, to force the bell to ring. It hadn't moved, not even slightly, as if it had become too heavy for the world itself. Now, villagers gathered near the entrance. They looked at Alden, expecting answers. He gave none. His eyes were fixed somewhere distant, unfocused. "Is it broken?" someone asked. Alden did not respond. Finally, one man stepped forward. "I'll ring it," he said with forced confidence. He entered the tower. Moments passed, then more. He came back down slowly, pale, shaking his head. "It won't move." A murmur spread through the crowd. Still quiet, still controlled, but something had shifted, because the bell had never failed. Not once, not in storm, not in winter, not in fire. And now it refused. That afternoon the village felt different. Shadows seemed longer, the forest closer. Even the air carried a strange weight, pressing lightly against the skin. And as evening approached, people began to wonder something they had never needed to wonder before. What happens when the bell does not ring again? By the time the second evening approached, the village had begun to change. Not in ways that could be easily pointed out, not in ways that could be spoken aloud and agreed upon, but in small things, subtle things, the kind of changes that slip quietly into the edges of daily life, unnoticed at first, until they begin to feel impossible to ignore. No one had rung the bell that morning, and no one had tried again. It wasn't that they had decided not to. It was simply that no one felt willing, as though the idea itself had grown heavy, unwelcome. The villagers moved through their day with a strange hesitation. A farmer paused longer than usual before stepping into his field. A woman stood over her washing bucket, hands still in cold water, staring at nothing for a moment too long. A group of children, usually loud and restless, played more quietly, glancing now and then toward the church tower without understanding why. The absence of the bell had created a gap, and something unspoken had begun to fill it. Brother Alden remained near the church. He had not climbed the tower again. He told himself there was no reason to. He had seen enough. And yet, his thoughts never left it. The crack, the cold, the sound. He had tried once to convince himself that he had imagined it, that the whisper had been nothing more than the echo of his own breath in a narrow space. But that explanation refused to settle, because something about the bell had changed, not visibly, not in a way others could easily see, but in a way that could be felt. By late afternoon, a quiet tension had spread across the village. People spoke less. They worked more slowly. Even the animals seemed unsettled. A dog barked at nothing, then whimpered and retreated. Chickens refused to stray far from their coops. A horse pulled back from its reins, eyes wide for no clear reason. The forest too felt closer, not physically, but in presence, as if the line between the village and the trees had grown thinner. That evening, no one waited for the bell, not openly, but many found themselves listening for it anyway. The sky dimmed, shadows stretched across the ground, candles were lit, doors were closed, and still nothing. Alden sat alone inside the church, the fading light slipping through narrow windows and painting long, pale shapes across the stone floor. He had spent the day avoiding the tower, but as darkness settled, the feeling returned, that pull, quiet, persistent. He stood slowly. His joints protested, but he ignored them. For a long moment he remained still, listening. The silence inside the church felt different from the silence outside, heavier, as though it were waiting. He took a step toward the tower door, then another. The wood creaked softly as he pushed it open. The stairway beyond was dark, narrow, unchanged. For a brief moment he considered turning back. No one had asked him to go. No one expected it. The village had already begun to accept the silence in its own uneasy way. But something inside him refused. Not curiosity, not duty, something else. He lifted the lantern and began to climb. The steps felt steeper than before. Or perhaps he was simply more aware of each one. His hand brushed the wall, fingers tracing the cold stone, as if searching for something steady to hold on to. Halfway up, he stopped again. The same place as the night before. He listened. There it was, faint, almost nothing. A sound, not from below, not from outside, from above. Alden's breath slowed. He did not want to name the sound, because naming it would make it real. He continued upward. At the top the bell awaited him, still, silent, unmoving. The crack was still there. Of course it was. But now it seemed slightly longer, or perhaps that was only the lantern light shifting across its surface. Alden stepped closer, but not as close as before. This time he did not reach out. He simply listened. At first nothing. Then, very slowly, the sound returned. A whisper, not clear, not formed into words, but layered, as though many faint voices were pressed together, speaking at once from somewhere far beneath the surface of the metal. Alden felt his chest tighten. The sound did not grow louder. It did not change. It simply continued, soft, endless, and then, very gently, The bell moved. Not a swing, not a ring, just a shift, barely visible, but enough. Alden took a step back. His lantern flickered. The shadows around him stretched and twisted across the stone walls. The whisper stopped. The bell returned to stillness. For several long moments Alden did not move. He did not breathe deeply. He did not speak. He only stood there, staring, as though the silence itself might break if he disturbed it. Finally, slowly, he lowered the lantern. He understood something now. Not fully, not clearly, but enough. The bell had not stopped. It had not broken. It had not failed. It had changed. And whatever now lived within its silence was listening. Outside, the village settled once more into uneasy sleep. No bell marked the passing of the hour. No sound carried across the fields. Only the quiet, deeper now than before, held everything in place. And in the tower, high above the darkened houses, the bell waited. The third night arrived without announcement. No bell marked its beginning. No sound guided the village into darkness. And yet, everyone felt it. Something had settled over the village. Not fear, not panic. Something quieter, heavier. People spoke in lower voices. Doors were closed earlier. Candles were watched more carefully, as if their small flames were the last fragile things holding the night at bay. Even those who did not believe in anything beyond the ordinary felt it, that something was wrong. Brother Alden did not leave the church that evening. He remained seated in the shadows, his lantern dim beside him, his eyes fixed on the tower door. He no longer tried to explain what he had heard or what he had felt. There were no words for it, only a certainty. The bell was no longer part of the village. The village was now part of the bell. As night deepened, the silence grew thicker. It pressed against the walls. It filled the empty spaces between thoughts. And slowly, something began to change. A woman woke suddenly, her breath quick and uneven. She had heard something, not outside, inside her dream. A faint, distant murmur. A child stirred in his sleep, his small hands tightening in the blanket. His lips moved as if answering a voice no one else could hear. Across the village, one by one, people shifted in their beds, not waking, not fully, but restless. And always, beneath it all, that same quiet whisper. In the tower the bell stood unmoving, but it was no longer silent. Alden felt it before he heard it, a pressure in the air, a presence. He rose slowly, his body heavy, his movements deliberate. This time there was no hesitation, no pause. He climbed the steps. The tower felt colder than before. The walls seemed narrower, the darkness deeper, and when he reached the top, the bell was waiting. The crack had widened, just enough to notice, just enough to change its shape. The whisper came again, clearer now, not louder, but closer. Alden closed his eyes, and for the first time he understood. The bell did not ring anymore, because it no longer needed to. It had found another way to be heard, not through the air, not across the fields, but inside the minds of those who listened. Alden stepped forward, slowly, calmly. He raised his hand, not in fear, not in doubt, but in acceptance. His fingers touched the cold metal, and this time the whisper did not stop. It welcomed him. Outside the village lay still, but something had changed, something quiet, something permanent. The next morning the people woke as they always did. They stepped outside, they spoke, they worked, but they moved differently, more slowly, more quietly. And though no bell rang, they no longer waited for it, because somewhere, deep inside, they could still hear it, not as a sound, but as a presence, a rhythm without noise, a call without voice. The bell had not failed, it had not broken, it had not disappeared, it had simply chosen silence, and in that silence it remained forever.